Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us in the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion powered by Clean Air Task Force. Before we begin, I'm going to draw your attention to the QR codes on either side of the pavilion in the back for live transcription and translation services if you need them. My name is David Yellen. I'm a strategic advisor here at CATF, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to this conversation on the geopolitics of climate action in partnership with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You might be wondering, before we get started, why an environmental and climate NGO is hosting a conversation on geopolitics. And I think the answers will become pretty clear as we go through the conversation, but I'll say just at the top, and probably again at the bottom, it's because we can't separate geopolitical issues from climate issues. Geopolitics is inextricably bound to our ability to execute on climate action because it impacts global supply chains, access to key resources, and many other issues that are key to our ability to execute on the commitments made here at COP. With that, I'll say, once again, we're very proud to partner with Carnegie, and I'll now turn it over to Noah Gordon, our partner on this event.
Thank you, David. My name is Noah Gordon, and I co-direct the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're really pleased to be partnering with Clean Air Task Force here. Our research focuses on how climate change is changing the world and changing the security landscape. So it makes sense that we're doing this event today. One of the great people I work with is my colleague, Annie Rood, who will introduce himself.
Sure. Thanks so much, Noah and David, for having us here. I'm Anirudh Suri. I'm a non-resident scholar with Carnegie India. Had worked with DC, the Carnegie DC office as well. And I work primarily on climate, technology, and geopolitics, and hence this session as well. But I'm also a tech venture capitalist. I invest in tech startups, including climate tech startups. And I'm also the author of a book called The Great Tech Game, which focused on tech and geopolitics. Rebecca.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Rebecca Tremaine, and I'm Head of UK Government Affairs at Clean Air Task Force.
Great, and thank you all for being here as well. Now, before we dive right in, this session's going to be run a little bit differently. We don't have a moderator or panelists per se. Instead, each of the four of us is going to present a key geopolitical trend for the year ahead that we think is affecting our ability to execute on climate action. And then we'll have a short discussion on each of those. We're hoping to save some time at the end for questions, for interaction, comments as well from the audience. So please feel free to offer those when the time comes. So the first trend, and I'm kicking us off here, is something we're referring to as industrial despecialization, and it's very closely linked with supply chain decoupling and many of the industrial policies that we're seeing passed in major economies around the world, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the NZIA in Europe, and others. And one of the fascinating things about these policies is, in the past, the US, Europe, Japan, others have been seen as centers of innovation. And on the other hand, China and other emerging economies has been seen as centers of manufacturing and process innovation. And what's new about these industrial policies and a departure in some ways is the amount of departure from comparative advantage specialization. And so in the US, the IRA has a lot of incentives for manufacturing. Similarly, Europe is looking to manufacture 40% of its clean energy needs domestically by 2030. And frankly, they're probably not the best manufacturing centers in the world. They can't really compete at the cost. And so they are really prioritizing domestic control of these supply chains in spite of that. And so why is that happening? Well, one is security and control over these technologies and resources. That has become increasingly important since the war in Europe and conflict elsewhere. Countries are trying to localize supply chains and ensure access. Another is what's on the slide here, which is China's basically dominating this game right now. The text may be a little small. The pink is China. And each of those is a key decarbonization technology, from solar on the left to electrolyzers and heat pumps on the right. China is the leading producer of all 5 of these to varying degrees, as you can see. But nonetheless, countries are responding to China's dominance and trying to prevent the same kind of value capture that has happened in solar and increasingly in wind from happening with the new advanced technologies, and in fact trying to combat it now. And so what are the consequences of the countries investing in areas where they maybe are not competitive? Well, one is just higher cost of the transition. If we're producing solar panels in the US and Europe, they're going to be more expensive than they are when they're produced in China. That's just a fact. Higher costs as well in general because we're duplicating investment across multiple regions, across multiple countries. And so if we're all spending money on solar production and not spending money and very scarce capital, frankly, on things that we are best at, then we are wasting that money in some sense. And we really need to make these investments of the scarce capital we do have as efficient as possible if we're going to succeed in this transition. And so the European Central Bank actually released a study somewhat recently on this topic exactly, on decoupling and what the consequences of that are. And they found that it can result in welfare losses up to 15%, which is pretty huge. And you know, that requires some amount of assumptions in terms of the amount of products covered. At lower levels, it's closer to 2 or 3%. But when we're talking about a country's economic welfare, 2 or 3% is still a pretty massive figure. So this is hugely consequential, and the reasons behind it make sense. And really, policymakers, certainly in the US, what we've seen is a catch-22, where the only possible way to pass the Inflation Reduction Act was to include domestic support for manufacturing, was to favor these communities. And so to the extent it allowed for the good pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act, it was critical. But that will also increase costs in the medium and long term of the transition. And so even though it may be more popular today, it may be less popular tomorrow. And conversely, if they actually just leaned on global supply chains and into an efficient use of resources, it would probably be unpopular today, but popular in the long term as costs stayed lower. And so I will close the sort of opening gambit of this by just saying, I think this trend it makes sense why it's happening. It makes a lot of sense, but I don't think we're equipped to deal with the consequences at the moment. And I think it will slow our ability to, one, develop the technologies we need at reasonable cost in the places we need it. And I think it will also slow technology diffusion across the world when we need it most. And so I'll close there and see if my colleagues, I mean, feel free to disagree with me too. I'm curious from your experiences what thoughts you might have on this trend that I've outlined.
I think I'll go first, and I mostly agree with your thesis. You also picked a great graph to demonstrate China's dominance in producing many of these technologies. Sort of a big picture point, I think we being humans in this case can actually afford to do the transition at a slightly higher cost. You know, most data shows that we need to spend about $3 or $4 trillion a year on the energy transition, but global GDP is around 100 trillion. And we already spend about 1% of that on the transition. Like we we are rich enough theoretically, and so buying a little bit of political support, even if it means doing the transition at a higher cost, could be worth it. So we'll have to see. That's the assumption policymakers are making now. It's hard to know what the right counterfactual is. Like if we didn't have policies like the IRA that favor domestic production, would we have anything at all, or would we have nothing? And that's the tricky question. Anirudh, Rebecca?
You know, so I think the cost piece is an interesting one, but we've got to look at it from a time dimension point as well. So what I mean by that is it's possible that the cost might go up for certain countries, not for necessarily for everyone, but for certain countries that were, let's say, very heavily dependent on China in the short term. But it is also possible that in 3 to 4 years' time, by the time they do develop indigenous capabilities for, let's say, solar, let's say in the case of India, it is very much possible that costs could actually come down further, as there are now more countries that are supplying some of the same equipment or cells, etc. So I do think that we've got to see whether the long-term impact will be cost accretive, or it's possible that with more competition, costs might eventually come down as well.
I wanted to touch a bit more on this idea of turning away from global supply chains. So you've given me an opportunity to talk about my favorite thing, which is Brexit. Obviously, as a Brit, comes up a lot, mostly in the pub. So I think, yeah, we've seen a lot of negative impacts, actually, just from removing ourselves from the European supply chain. So if you take a look at the UK's economy, there's an estimated negative impact around 2 to 3% of GDP. We've also seen reductions in goods trade, so from the UK to the EU by 16%, and you also have from the EU to the UK by 20%. So we've seen quite a lot of negative impacts there. It also has, that's not to mention in terms of mobility of the workforce, of the expertise that you gain from allowing your workforce to move around. So I think that's just interesting to note that it's had a negative impact in the UK by sort of turning away from this global supply chain idea. We've also seen that they've had to make changes. So between the EU and the UK recently, they've had to essentially delay they were about to introduce tariffs that would have been about 10% because their EV supply chains were mostly coming from China. So they've had to delay this by 3 years, showing that they actually can't always enforce the things that they want to do when they're introducing it domestically. I'd also say, just from the UK's experience, I think it's quite different to, say, the US. We don't have the funding, despite being a developed country, to essentially develop an advantage in many of these different sectors. So we really do have to focus on those areas where we have comparative advantage. So for us, that looks like CCS, offshore wind, sustainable aviation fuels, and we're really going to have to try and pick some winners, I think, for the limited amount of funding that we have available.
Did you want to respond?
I was going to respond to several points. I think a lot of interesting things were raised. I also want to point, I started right in on energy, but this isn't a trend that's isolated in the energy industry. I mean, this is happening across technological industries, semiconductors being perhaps the most high profile outside of energy, with the CHIPS Act in the US and some strategic autonomy in the EU, as well as other countries. And it's not limited to just the final products, right? I mean, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, export controls on their critical materials. So this is a trend that's happening across the economy, and it's not entirely energy driven. And the point I want to make is, rather the question I want to pose to you, and no, I probably was unrelated to your point, so feel free to just run right over it. I'm curious whether we think the effects will be different in energy versus other industries, and I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that we want every country on the planet to have access to these technologies. The U.S. can invest all it wants in these technologies, and as you point out, it's the richest country on the planet. It probably should pay over dollar, right, to make this happen, if anybody should. And so, but I think it's different, right? I mean, if some countries don't have access to semiconductors as soon, yes, that will definitely slow economic development, but we don't have the same kind of united global push for these technologies to be available. So I don't know how that affects the impacts of this trend, but I'm curious if anybody has thoughts on that.
You mean to say it's worse for the planet if we slow down the spread of solar panel production than semiconductor production?
Yes, I'm saying perhaps with the critical security commodities, it's less of a global negative to slow down. It's certainly a regional negative and a localized negative. Whereas slowing this particular transition down, slowing down the diffusion of these technologies, will have far more lasting impacts on global welfare. And so my question is, I guess I'm making a point, which is that seems bad, and I'm asking a question, which is, do we think that those dynamics mean that the effects will be different?
Before I let you two come in, I will say there's been some spillover from export controls on semiconductors to clean tech. I mean, the U.S.'s moves there have pushed China or given China a pretext, depending on your perspective, to restrict exports of gallium, germanium, graphite, and perhaps some solar panel technology. But I know we're about to close up this first theme. Did either of you two have a point?
I just have a quick point to add. See, given we're talking about semiconductors as well, one of the things that we're seeing because of the export controls that the US has put, right, on China for the advanced chips, there's now all this talk and some evidence that the Chinese have managed to actually fasten their pace of development. Right? And that's kind of the point I was trying to make earlier as well, that it's not necessary that the cost will definitely go up. Actually, given that there'll be a diverse set of countries, as long as there is a diverse set of countries that is producing some of these elements that we're talking about of the energy supply chain, I do think that actually we might see more innovation, which might actually lead to reduction in costs as well. Second point I want to make, which I think people in India actually make quite clearly, is that this kind of move away from China or dependent on China does not mean depending on one other country either, any other country, right? So the de-risking is to the point of diversification of that risk, not to say I'm just going to shift my risk from one country A to now country B. And I think to that extent, if the world does play out like that, that instead of one, now we have 5 countries making, let's say, solar panels at good cost, we might actually see its benefit just in maybe 3-4 years from now.
Great. I think we're going to move on to the second trend, so I'll hand it over to Noah.
Thanks, David. The second geopolitical trend shaping climate action this year is the rising cost of capital. You see on the graph here, this is the number of rate hikes in markets since 2021. the key point is there have been a lot of rate hikes, and then we now have key sort of base interest rates like the federal funds rate in the U.S. over 5%. And one of our themes today is that politicians generally don't prioritize climate change. They prioritize other things like geopolitical competition and the economy and security and being reelected. This is also true for central bankers. Whether you're climate conscious like the ECB and you take into account climate in your rules for corporate bond purchases, or you're like the U.S. Fed when your head Powell says that you're not a climate policymaker, neither one prioritizes climate. That's just not their mandate. And so the needs of the energy transition don't set interest rates. It's what happens in the real world that does that. Trade wars, real wars, supply shocks. And these high rates are really bad for the energy transition for a few reasons. First, the energy transition means building new stuff, and that means borrowing money to do so for construction. And capital costs are a much bigger share of renewable and low carbon projects than they are fossil fuel projects. Saw some data that if the cost of capital goes up from 5 to 7%, for utility scale solar, your levelized cost of energy is up over 20% from that. But if you're a utility scale gas plant, it's only up 5%. So there's a major difference there just from a small increase. And we see examples of this in the real world now. In the Northeast US you have the renewable energy company Ørsted writing down offshore wind projects, and in New York having to raise rates to cover the higher cost of construction and of capital. And these high rates are also straining government budgets. In countries like Germany, where there's constitutional limits on what they can borrow, and the Supreme Court has now just told the German government it can't have basically off-budget climate funds anymore. Germany is struggling to borrow the money to spend to meet its climate ambitions. And new borrowers like the EU, which borrowed money in the wake of COVID, are also paying higher costs. And they have this budget crunch, also caused by another geopolitical factor, and the war in Ukraine and their efforts to deliver aid to Ukraine. Second part of my point is that all of this is worse in developing countries where your currency may not be a safe asset. Some IEA data from 2021 had the average cost of capital for solar at 3 or 4% in Europe or North America, but at 9 or 10% in India. Both numbers are much higher now. And actually we're in the UAE now, last year's host of COP, Egypt, put in their NDC that they weren't able to take advantage of the falling cost of solar panels and their significant solar potential because they're debt distressed and spending so much money on paying back debt. I think now they're spending 12% of their GDP just on interest payments, which is pretty astonishing. So rising US rates boost the dollar and make repayment harder for countries and firms who borrowed in dollars but get paid in other currencies. In closing, really, geopolitical turmoil raises the cost of building new stuff, and that's really bad. That can be okay for incumbents, but it's really bad for people trying to disrupt or transform giant sectors like the energy sector. So it's critical that we have more concessional finance where possible, and this will persist as we look ahead. The FT just polled economists who expect interest rates in the U.S. to stay high through the summer of 2024 and only decline slowly from there. So this isn't going away, and it's something we'll keep talking about at the next COP, probably. I'm curious what my other co-panelists think about this.
And if you want to, one of the questions I have actually for you on this is, one of the things I saw recently when the G20 was held in India and climate finance came up, India, which was the president during this past G20, was quite clear that one of the priorities was climate finance. And as part of that priority, the demand in a way, or the vision there was to bring down costs of lending to countries like India from the MDBs, from the multilateral development banks. And so the question to you is, do you think that these geopolitical disruptions that we are seeing in the world will make it less likely that the MDBs will be able to do the reforms that they need to do? Or do you think that now the pressure is even higher on them, and hence it's more likely that the MDB reform will happen and the private sector capital will be more easily leveraged by these MDBs to fund climate projects in countries like India at a cheaper cost? Which way do you think this might go?
I think the pressure is coming more from the urgency of the energy transition and anything to do with the interest rates, but I think it probably makes it harder. on net. I mean, we talked about needing more concessional finance, but the finance has to be quite concessional if the average loans are at 5 or 6%. I mean, for in something like a Jet P, I know South Africa got most of its money in concessional finance, but there's still a lot where they're paying standard market rates. So it probably makes things harder. I mean, the countries that the World Bank's shareholders are also paying more money to pay back their debts. We see that happening in the U.S. now as it struggles to, paying more for its borrowing and trying to manage Ukraine and Israel and so on. So yeah, the whole environment is more difficult.
I think we can also probably bring this back to the political will for climate action because, say, for example, in the UK, we've seen a rowback on climate policies in response to a cost of living crisis. Things like we had a recent offshore wind auction to try and secure future offshore wind, which essentially failed because the costs of building the infrastructure were too expensive due to inflation and the rising cost of living. So I think it has an impact also on governments' willingness to make new commitments. And also, obviously, deliver on the commitments that they've made. This is also, in the UK, it's tied up very much with an election cycle and where the government sees an opportunity to sort of appeal to the voter. And they could use this essentially as an excuse to row back on some of the climate policies that they've put out there.
Yeah, we've seen that roll back already. It's an interesting point about the offshore wind, because another reason why the high cost of money is so tough for renewables is they sometimes have they're locked into power purchasing agreements and their income is kind of set, but their costs can go up quite a lot and it can really change things. David, you were going to...
Yeah, and Noah, I hope you'll accept some friendly disagreement from one of your earlier points. In our last discussion, I'm not sure that we're rich enough as a planet to pay through the teeth for this or overpay for it. And frankly, I think the interest rate challenge is a key part of that, but it's also just about capital availability. I mean, yeah, we have a lot of money globally, but it's not like it's floating around waiting to be spent, right? It's largely being put to things. And so, I think one point there is we're going to need at least $1 trillion a year by 2030 for just emerging economies, not including China, to make this transition. That's going to have to reach 2 by 2050, and those are probably underestimates because they probably assume that those countries' energy use per capita is going to remain pretty similar, and so I think we need to overshoot that if at all possible, which maybe given progress over the past few years, it's not. But just for comparison, our global healthcare spending is $9 trillion. Our global military spending is around 2.2. And those numbers are going to go up too. I mean, and that's part of this conversation, right? I think, especially in the wake of COVID-19, healthcare spending is going to have to go up. And I want to be optimistic. It's probably not the last time we have a global pandemic or something like that strains healthcare systems. And we need to be ready for that, and that requires investment. And similarly, conflicts will drive military spending up. And so there's a lot of competition for this money, and it's not cheap money, right? And I think the other point there is the money that is available for investment is largely held by large institutional investors that don't have a high risk tolerance, and certainly, besides traditional proven fossil assets, energy assets these days don't really meet those criteria except in certain cases, and certainly in the economies we need to be building the most new energy, the most new clean energy. The risk is simply not, it's too high for a lot of those big institutional investors. And so I think we need to find a way to de-risk these things in order for the capital supply available for that to be higher. But I agree entirely with your points here. I think this is an enormous challenge. We need to figure out a way to make money cheaper when we need it for public good, which is a government role, right? And so I'm curious about what kind of government solutions to this we have, what kind of government solutions to the capital availability problem there are. But it's a huge scale challenge, right? And we also need to have able and relatively free flows of capital across regions, or regions are going to be left behind, and certainly left behind if they don't have access to develop their domestic resources in the way they want to.
Yeah, you might well be right, unfortunately. If it's time to build again, as someone wrote in a famous Silicon Valley blog post, it's also time to compete for capital again. And climate isn't the only crisis. We need to build a lot more housing for other reasons, and then you've got the steel demand there that doesn't go to wind turbines and so on. Anirudh, I know you run a climate tech focused VC in India. How does this affect your business day to day?
So I think the point that the question you've asked is linked to a broader point I was going to make. you just mentioned, right? It's time to compete for capital. I think whether or not we have sufficient capital, I actually not really prepared to say, but it is, I think, clear that countries and companies will have to compete much harder, and that applies to startups as well. I think that in my day-to-day work around climate tech venture, I'm seeing that even though there was a big, you know, positive optimism around climate tech startups since 2020, 2021, over the last 2, 3 years, both in Silicon Valley, in Europe, and here, and a lot of capital was raised for it. Actually, a lot of VCs are finding, at least in India and Asia broadly, hard to find actually great startups. So actually, funnily enough, in that early stage space, there's a lot of capital now floating around saying, I'm looking for great climate entrepreneurs, but there isn't that much tech innovation happening for VCs to fund. So you'll find that most climate tech VCs in India have not made as many investments as they anticipated, right? And I think one of the reasons for that is that I think we have to also think about where money is getting spent, right? So I think I make this point a lot. I've done internet tech VC investment now for the last decade. There, it was much easier for entrepreneurs to come up with interesting startups without having a research or a scientific background. But I believe in the climate tech world, it's not as easy for anyone to come up and say, here's the next big climate tech startup that I'm working on, unless they have some kind of research or scientifically backed solution that they're going to work on, right? So if you look at carbon capture, you look at a whole lot of these verticals within climate tech, it actually requires a fair bit of science, fair bit of research, fair bit of investment in that R&D. So I do hope that some of this capital also goes into R&D, much like I think what you see in the IRA also. But I do think that the broader point from a geopolitical standpoint is that now countries will have to compete also, right? Not just companies. And I think there it'll be interesting to see which countries up their game. Because the countries that do up their game, they'll find the large private institutional investors, hedge funds, pension funds, etc., will direct more of their capital there. And I know one of the conversations within India on this is that India has to de-risk its general cost of doing business in India for projects, so that the larger investors globally find it much easier to invest in India, because then a lot of the non-project related risks, right, can be reduced, right? General ease of doing business, etc., right? Predictability of regulation, visibility into long-term action plans of countries, right? So I think that is the positive action step, I think, that arises from your point that capital is going to be either costlier or scarce or both.
On your point about climate startups versus tech or internet startups, it's just harder to do stuff in the physical world, and you're more reliant on public action and things like, do we have the distribution and transmission for this power project, or you're affected by mining regulations in Chile and Australia. There's so many other reasons why it's harder to just come up with a good idea. Rebecca, you kind of anticipated my question about how this is playing out in the UK, and did interest rates affect Sunak's rollback? But you think it'll persist, and even if Labour came back into power, the UK wouldn't be willing or able to borrow money and kick off a bigger transition?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think Labour's promised to spend 28 billion a year up to 2030 on essentially a green industrial strategy. But since announcing that, they've already sort of backed off, because they're seeing the situation, they're seeing the fact that there's other crises, like, for example, in the UK, the NHS, the National Health Service, is something that they're going to have to really focus on when they come into power, potentially. So I think the intention is definitely there, but yeah, we're definitely seeing that it's already quite difficult, and they're going to have to really figure out how to spend that money efficiently.
One reason it's so frustrating to hear about these other crises that are competing for money with the energy transition is that we just had like a whole decade where interest rates were quite low, and we had relatively few major geopolitical crises. There's always something, but now, just as governments and companies are taking this more seriously, we face this difficult environment. But on that happy note, I think we're ready to move over to Anirudh and the third theme.
Great. Thanks so much, Noah. So what I'm going to try and do is the trend I'm going to talk about, the broader trend, is the shifting centers of gravity in the world that will affect climate action. And what I've tried to do is actually come up with 6 shifts within that broader trend that I want to talk to you guys about. And I'll try and go through them quickly so that we can have then a little bit of discussion. The first shift in my mind is the shifting of the general framing in which countries are thinking about climate action, right, around the world. Now, what do I mean by that? You know, a few years ago when the geopolitical crises that we're now going through were not as pronounced, geopolitics was not trumping economics, right? But today now we are living in a world where you talk to policymakers pretty much in most countries of the world, at least the major countries of the world, you'll find, I think as Noah, you were saying, leaders are now thinking about the geopolitical more than the economic, right? And I think because of that, there's a lot of emphasis on things that, you know, even David, you were talking about, which is figuring out, okay, how do I reduce my dependence on XYZ elements of the supply chain that I might be dependent on unfriendly countries, etc. But geopolitical risk has heightened, and I think that's a big shift, right? Where economics usually wins, I think right now geopolitical thinking and geopolitical calculations are dominating. At the same time, I want to add almost a counter to this point, and I think Rebecca, this just came from the comments you were making, is that, you know, even in my book, which I was talking about, The Great Tech Game, one of the things I talk about is that tech is driving the economy today for most major countries, like in the US, even in countries like India, definitely in China also. Tech has been driving the dynamism in these countries' economies. But tech industry comes with one big downfall, which is that it actually increases inequality in countries. And I think that's goes to the kind of domestic economic considerations that you were talking about in the UK. You're seeing that across, I think, many countries in the world, including in the US, where, you know, I was surprised even at, the Global Tech Summit that Carnegie just organized in Delhi over the last 3 days. One of the key things that US officials there were talking about was we don't want just growth, we want growth with equality. We want growth with sufficient returns for domestic workforce, right? Which is very common to hear from Indian politicians, but I was surprised to hear that from US politicians and US officials. And I think that trend will continue where decisions will be taken on the global stage, keeping domestic economic considerations in mind. So that's shift number one. Shift number two is that there's a general geo-economic shift from the West to Asia and the Indo-Pacific in terms of economic power, right? Which is, I think, what this slide is also trying to show, that at purchasing power parity, BRICS by 2028 will have more purchasing power parity based GDP than the G7, right? That's just one statistic, but I think the broader trend is clear that the world economic power is shifting from the West to Asia, Indo-Pacific, etc. And what that will mean is, I think, two things. One is, I think that global governance, right, today has largely been the domain of what China obviously would also call West-dominated institutions, right? The G7, the UN, OECD, etc. Now, what's going to happen is, as this economic power shifts, right, to Asia and the Indo-Pacific, the institutional mix that we'll have in global governance is going to be much more complex. It's not going to be as straightforward as having a G7 and having even a BRICS, as we were discussing prior to the discussion. I think there'll be fissures within the G7, often because of domestic considerations in each of the G7 countries. You'll have fissures in organizations like the BRICS, because even within the BRICS, you see India, China, and Russia will often disagree on many geopolitical issues, and Brazil as well. And so you'll find that a lot of fissures within existing organizations will happen in terms of institutions. Second, there'll be many new institutions that will come up. And a recent trend that some of you might have seen over the last few years is we are going from an era where we had global institutions that had the participation of the majority of the countries of the world to regional institutions. So BRICS, the Quad, many such groupings are coming up in the world where countries are saying, I might not be able to ally with 100 other countries or even 20 other countries on some issues, but I can actually align or agree with maybe 3. So I'm going to form a grouping of 4 or 5 countries where I can actually get something done. But the result of, I think, this kind of regional institutions coming up is I think that the climate action is going to get more fractured as well, right? That I think certain countries that have interests aligned, let's say around offshore wind, might actually get together to pull that piece further. And similarly, for example, I'll give you an example of a new alliance that has come up, a new organization called the World Biofuels Alliance. Now, this has India, Brazil, and the US, and I think a few other countries in there. The reason this group of 3 or 4 have come together is because these 3 or 4 countries have a vested interest in pushing biofuels as a bigger part of countries' energy mix, because they also happen to be the biggest producers of biofuels, right? So I think that's the general second trend I wanted to talk about, a shift. The third shift I want to talk to you about is the changing nature of the energy mix, right? I think we are going into a world where the energy mix will definitely change, right, compared to 20 years ago. But the result is, I think, while we had big oil and gas winners in the past, now we're going to have different winners in, for example, solar. We'll have different winners in offshore wind. We'll have different winners in biofuels, different winners in nuclear, as SMRs maybe pick up. And what that will mean is, I think, for climate action is that, again, we'll have sort of forces pulling us away from concerted climate action, because each of these winners, and also losers, by the way, losers of the pieces of the energy mix that are currently dominant, will try and, as we are seeing, I think, even in this COP and other places, the countries that think that they'll be losers in the new energy mix will actually pull for very different kinds of climate action, versus countries that believe they'll win in the future, who will be pulling, I think, climate action in a very different direction. And related to this third shift is the shift number 4 that I want to talk about, which is, I think that while in the past, in the energy mix, we had countries that were sitting on large commodities or fossil fuels be the winners in the energy world, I think now we'll have a trend where countries that are competing and then doing well in climate technologies, and not just mining of raw material or rare materials from the earth, I think those countries are likely to be the emerging winners in this climate game as a way. So countries that develop better batteries, better storage, green hydrogen more efficiently, better carbon capture, use space to whatever extent that can be done to drive climate action, and startup ecosystems that can drive frugal innovation in climate technologies, I think those countries are likely to win and then shape action accordingly. The fifth shift is the shift in the nature of climate finance institutions. So traditionally, climate finance has been driven by governments, has been driven by multilateral development banks, and institutions like that. But I think we are seeing a clear transition, at least being attempted, to take finance away from being the domain only of the public sector globally to bringing a lot more private sector in, right? And I think with Ajay Banga at the World Bank, you hear a lot of this from the World Bank as well. But I think various governments have also realized that given the domestic economic constraints that most governments are facing domestically, especially with elections coming up, I think we've discussed this, I think 70% of the world, I think, is going into elections next year, or some number like that. You'll find that more and more governments and MDBs will try and pull in private capital. The implication of that is going to be, one, as I think we were discussing, I think, Noah, in your section, is that countries will really have to up their game to attract the private capital, because private capital will be a lot less forgiving than MDBs might have been, right? But it'll also mean a second geopolitical implication, which is that unlike the MDBs, who I believe were generally not keeping friendships or geopolitical enmities as the main deciding factor, I think in a lot of cases, the private sector actually will stay away from financing projects in countries that are not friendly with the source of that, right? So private sector financial institutions in the US are unlikely to be funding that much of, I don't know, solar projects in China, for example. I'm giving a very obvious one, but I think it'll play out in many smaller countries as well, where friendly nations are likely to get a lot more capital than unfriendly nations, right? Depending on the source of the capital. The last shift I want to talk about is, which I've kind of covered, is I think as we see this shift towards private corporations, I think one of the key things we'll need is more innovation, right? While earlier the trend was, okay, building just bigger and bigger projects in whichever part of the energy mix we believed would solve the climate problem in a given country. I think we'll need a lot more capital to be going into R&D and innovation at the base level so that we can actually have more efficient solutions. So those are the 6 broad shifts in centers of gravity I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I sort of want to respond with something perhaps controversial,
No,
perhaps
please do.
not on the panel. I think this is a good thing. I certainly think, this graph, what we're seeing here, is a good thing. The BRICS account for a far larger percentage of global population than the G7 does. And so them having more GDP is great. I think we want to see more wealth going into these populous countries. I also think, on balance, the fragmentation point you brought up sounds bad, sounds scary for global cooperation. I actually think there are some pretty good outcomes that may come from it. For an example of what might be bad, one of the big outcomes from this COP is a pledge to triple renewables and double energy efficiency. Of the 5 founding BRICS countries, only Brazil has signed on to that. And so why do I think, on balance, this is still okay, maybe positive? Well, one, I don't think China or India would change its policies significantly if it did sign that pledge. I think, China certainly supports a global tripling of renewable capacity because they build the renewables that we're deploying. I think the reason I think it's actually positive in a deeper sense is that, as you mentioned, Anirudh, coming out of that is more regional groups, more functionally focused groups than a global group, and more democratic in a way. And so I think, at CATF we talk a lot about having regional energy transition strategies because the context, the resources, the opportunities available to different regions are vastly different, even to countries within the same region. And so to the extent that we have more cooperation at those levels, I think all the better. I think fragmentation, yes, it's scary. I think it hurts our ability to reach unanimous decisions at COP. But the solutions that are going to work in the United States and Europe are not the solutions that are necessarily going to work everywhere else. And so having a process that is more democratic, more regionally focused, I think, is potentially a way that we will end up deploying solutions faster and in a more equitable way.
I think I agree with you that I think that not all of these trends are negative. I think some of these trends are actually positive, and this particular one, I think you're right. We are seeing, for example, in South Asia, there's a push. I'm not saying it's happened fully, but there's a push for a regional grid, for a regional electricity grid, right? And then connections with the Middle East and Southeast Asia, right, for this electricity grid. And I think if that gets pulled off as a regional solution, I think it'll be amazing because you have so many different countries with different strengths in different parts of the energy mix that a regional electricity grid will actually be much more resilient and be able to use renewable sources a lot more in a more stable manner if there's a regional mix. So I agree with you that you might see some very interesting solutions come up because of regional institutions and regional cooperation.
I actually just wanted to pick up on this point about climate action becoming more fractured and how it relates to what we're seeing at the COP. So I think the UNFCCC negotiations are starting to change the way they think about this because now we're seeing the global stocktake. We know that we need more implementation of climate pledges. And so how can the negotiations actually respond to enable that to happen? So I think this is a really interesting dynamic. As David said, you get sort of a multiplex of these different sectoral initiatives that emerge, and they basically come alongside the negotiations. So you get different countries who have different socioeconomic, different political circumstances when it comes to implementation, and obviously they need different solutions depending on where they are. So you get this distinction between negotiations that are often about rules and setting reporting requirements, for example, and then actually how do you go about implementing what you've said you're going to do. So I think there are ways to bring implementation more into the negotiations themselves, and we are seeing that happen. There's been some interesting dynamics actually at the COP this year, particularly in relation to the BRICS. So you're seeing new dynamics among countries. They're trying to actually bring in some of these trade measures into the negotiations. So the WTO is obviously not making much progress on trade, and therefore you have countries they're actually doing it to try and review measures like the IRA and the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, but they are looking at bringing different issues into the negotiations that we haven't seen in the history of the UNFCCC before. So I think that's really, really interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
You know, the graph we're looking at is about shifting centers of gravity in terms of GDP, but we're also seeing shifting center of gravity in terms of climate policymaking power. I mean, we also have emissions are rising in the BRICS countries and falling in the G7 countries. And if, you know, we talked about elections happening next year, if the less climate conscious countries win elections in the US and for the EU Parliament, we might have climate policy stagnation in those places, whereas in Brazil, India, and China, you still see change. So by 2028, when this graph ends, we'll be in a different landscape when it comes to which capitals are really deciding what's happening.
No, I agree. Yeah, and a lot of different interest groups within those countries, then, if they have the supportive governments, will then become much more powerful. So I think with that we can shift, Rebecca, to your fourth trend.
Yeah, so the final trend that we're going to speak about is this focus on energy security and security of supply. So COP itself is obviously emerging amongst a number of intersecting crises. We've got the Gaza-Israel conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war, and subsequent cost of living crisis that has emerged in many regions across the world. And this has really seen a refocus on energy security. So governments around the world have started to focus very much on energy supplies and not necessarily, as we've already said, starting to think about how they can decarbonize alongside that. So the graph, I think, can we go a long one? The graph here is actually from Nature. It was published in February, and it really shows you the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on household energy costs across the world, both for heating, for cooling, and also for mobility. So you can see there just how much of an impact it actually had on consumer prices, and really made a difference. So you also get this indirect impact of costs. So other goods and services were impacted by this. So, for example, fertilizer became a lot more expensive. And this means that governments then actually also have to focus on food security alongside energy security. So you get a shift in what governments are focusing on globally. So I've touched briefly on the causes of this, but I'll give a bit more detail. So energy markets post the pandemic were already tightened. And then you had the Russia-Ukraine crisis kicking off in February last year, which really then started to move into a global energy crisis. And you have this energy price surge, which results from, so the post-pandemic economic recovery happened quicker than we expected it to happen. We've got the conflict where Russia is a major exporter of oil and gas, particularly to Europe. And you've got this continued high reliance on fossil fuels. So you end up with countries having a mismatch really between the energy demand and the supply that they're able to get from Russia, essentially. In European countries, this looked like a fuel supply shortage, and in emerging economies, you had high fuel import costs and fuel deprivation. So it looks differently slightly across the world, but as a result, you get, as I said, governments prioritizing energy security over decarbonization. So if you take a look at the G7, they started boycotting Russian oil, introduced price caps to try and decrease the revenue that Russia was making on those sales. Although, having looked at that a year on, apparently it has actually made quite a little, not that much difference to their revenue costs, which is quite interesting. And the EU prohibited import of oil and refined petroleum products from Russia. They've said that they're going to phase those out by 2027, so they obviously couldn't do it immediately, but they have set a target to do that in the future. You then see this diversification of energy supplies, as we've already touched on. So you get an increase in some cases in fossil fuel use. So as Europe was moving away from Russia, it started to increase the amount of liquefied natural gas that it was using, and it changed the suppliers that it was getting this from. So you have the US, Norway, and the Middle East becoming core suppliers. The UK also increased the amount that it started to export to the EU. So you see a difference in who's providing that energy and where it's coming from. You also see an increase in fossil fuel subsidies, so they rose by 2 trillion to 7 trillion in 2022, so that's quite a significant increase. And upstream oil and gas production and consumption is expected to rise by 7% this year. So you've seen an increase in fossil fuel use at a time when really we should be urgently moving away from using fossil fuels. And we've obviously seen at COP that there have been calls to phase out. An example in the UK is the government has used energy security almost as an excuse to increase oil and gas production. So we get 4% only from Russia, but they've opened new oil and gas licensing rounds in the name of energy security. You also have, however, so that was quite a bleak picture, but you do also have a massive increase in investment in clean technology. So, for example, in certain countries, in Beijing and India, it doesn't make sense to try and rely on imports of fossil fuels from other countries. They've just ramped up investment in clean tech domestically. And there's been a record investment. So more than 1.7 trillion in 2023 has been invested in clean tech, and that is much higher than the amount that's been put into fossil fuels. The other thing which David's already touched on, I'll just emphasize, is this reshoring to counter dominance in supply chains. So making sure that we don't move from a reliance on fossil fuels from particular countries to relying on other countries in order to create renewable technologies. So that graph that we already had showed this quite well. China has got at least 60% of the world's manufacturing capacity for solar panels, for the components of wind energy, and also for batteries. So countries are then looking at how they can create that domestically and boosting investment in all kinds of different type of supply. So I think this is quite an interesting trend. What I would say is I think energy security can go hand in hand with decarbonisation. We've seen that through the increase in clean technology investment. I think the thing that countries will need to be thinking about is how they ensure they've got this like clean, secure supply of energy, clean firm power. How can they make sure that if some intermittent renewables aren't available, that they have their own sources as well of clean firm power? But I'd be very interested to see what my fellow panelists think about this.
I think one, like, very well laid out, Rebecca. I think it gets to the heart of the panel topic here, and actually, I think it's not just energy security; it's economic security too. And one of the results here is that the Inflation Reduction Act is the biggest piece of climate legislation in the U.S., and you wouldn't know it from the name, right? And so that's why this happened, right? It's these kinds of disruptions, geopolitical disruptions, that drive up energy costs, that lead to inflation, and that's when governments are acting. And so, we got sort of lucky that geopolitics, as horrible as the events are, and they continue to be, have driven us in the right direction in the U.S. a bit. I mean, I think we've seen backsliding in a lot of other places, so on balance, it's probably still negative. But I think this leads to the point that we want to make with this whole event, which is we can't separate climate and security. We can't separate climate and geopolitics. And to a certain extent, it may make more sense for us to try to work with the security policymakers and the economic policymakers rather than separating climate on its own, right? I think a lot of the progress we've seen over the past 2 years has been a direct result of a lot of the disruptions. And so and it goes both directions as well, I think is an important point. We've seen a lot of geopolitics impacting climate action. Climate change really impacts geopolitics and will do so increasingly. It's been described as a threat and risk multiplier. I think we'll see an increase in disruptions from weather events, forced migration, water scarcity. I mean, these are all ways that geopolitics is going to be affected by climate change. And so I think the point is we need to, one, make that clear to the people making foreign policy, and also really think about how geopolitical trends impact our ability to execute the commitments we make here. And in some cases, I think it'll enable them. In other cases, I think it'll make it more challenging. But I think, really well laid out presentation on how important security is. And I think Anirudh raised that point earlier. Maybe economics was always the king, and now, to a certain extent, security has claimed that.
Yeah, you said it better than I could, Rebecca. A refocus on energy security has mixed effects on decarbonization. I mean, you were talking about how Northern Europeans were doing more gas drilling in the North Sea in response to the price shock, but you also had Europeans spending more on solar panels and raising renewable targets. And in a country like China, you have one reason China has been pushing so hard on EVs is because then they don't have to rely on foreign oil shipments, but at the same time, it means domestic coal supplies are there for it. So it always has a mixed effect. On balance, I think the energy shock of last year was probably good for decarbonization and sort of gave a boost to it in most regions. But yeah, some good, some bad.
I feel like we should, if any of you have questions, so please feel free to ask any of us. But the one question in the meanwhile I do have, Rebecca, is for you, is as countries focus on their particular national energy security, do you think that it'll make it harder for them to coordinate and collaborate with each other? Or do you think that certain countries will find common ground, to the point I was making earlier, that maybe there'll be 5 countries that'll find common ground on X, and hence we might see more action. What's your sense?
I think we will still see collaboration, I think, out of necessity. We've talked a lot about the cost of this stuff. It's expensive. It's going to help if you work together to find some of the solutions. And there are areas where you can't do this alone. So if you take, for example, the UK and the EU, and you're talking about carbon capture and storage, they need to work together to figure out how to move that carbon around and where they can store it. Because the UK's got huge resources on the North Sea, and they need to find out a way to use them. So I think out of necessity, I think also one of the things we've been thinking about is the fact that this acts as a really good foundation for diplomacy and foreign policy for other countries. So where you might not be able to speak about particular issues, we see the US and China using climate as a foundation for this relationship. So actually, there are good opportunities for them to collaborate on climate in the name of this wider security focus. And it's sort of like an opening enabler for further relationship building, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Please.
Thank you very much for that very interesting panel, all four of you. I'm Mirta Chapathi. I represent several NGOs, but Voices of Nuclear in particular. My question is, you in particular mentioned the shift from public to private capital financing. I was wondering what you guys thought about the shift from public to private control of energy production, energy systems, energy security as well, if that would lead to better or less optimization of energy systems, maybe more inequalities or not. I know I suppose you're gonna stress on innovation, but is that all there is? And where do we find progress in all this? Instead of innovation, progress versus innovation.
Myself, Dr. Pradeep Punia. I'm from India. My organization working in Rajasthan state, northern western part, that is known as Thar Desert. My question is simple, that private sector play a significant roles in this zero carbon future because their versions is absolutely correct on the theme of livelihood and nature. But their involvement in the policy makings or other levels are zero. They have not ensured at any level, at any extent about the policies framework and other things. We have started a campaign connect to climate for this to aware the local populations. But the politics levels and other levels are some hazardous, generate some hazardous situations. We have not came out from those hazardous or obstacles. So which kind theory, which kind of principle we should adopt to make such kind achievement?
I'll maybe try and take a stab at the first question. I think that's a great question. I haven't given it too much thought, but whatever initial thoughts come to mind, I'll share. I think that as you were describing that question, what was going on in my mind was this is the classic public-private question, right, in a way. Countries like India, for example, face this problem not just in climate or energy, but in every sector, right? To what extent does the public sector give up control to the private sector, and what implications that'll have? And my own sense is that in most cases, with the right set of guardrails and regulation, you'll have generally net positive effects of letting the private sector come in. I'll give you a specific example. So if it's energy production in biofuels, right? Currently, it's very heavily regulated in a country like India. But I think if the market was allowed to dominate, market forces driven by private sector control, full private sector control, I think you'd find that the prices would drop, better technology would come in, to your point about innovation. So I do think that net positive, my sense is that private control will be better off. But again, that's something I have to think about because I think it's a question I haven't given too much thought to. But do any of you have a thought on that question, on private sector control, given more of the private sector will be funding? Yeah, of course, please.
Sorry. And I'm French, so that's probably till tent a little bit my question. in the sense that the energy production and how much you can provide and how reliably you can provide it to the population underlies everything else. So it underlies all the other social services you can provide, from education to health to whatnot, food security as well. So there is, at least in France, a quite clear correlation between the social model that the French people have been able to enjoy and the fact that they've maybe avoided up to now some electoral consequences that other major countries have not avoided yet. That's quite related to, for example, the nuclear fleet, which provided a certain amount of energy security, energy independence, energy reliability, low cost, all those being very important to fuel all the rest of the economy and the social benefits you can expect. So how much optimization, so the market, I suppose, optimize things a little bit, but is that very much something that we can expect or give out to the market? Or maybe we can provide this from control and then let the market generate everything else depending on it.
I think, unfortunately, this is a bit of a non-answer, because I think it really depends on the context of the country in which we're talking about, the community in which we're talking about. I mean, we have private utilities in the U.S., and I think, you know, we've made a lot of progress. We have a relatively well-functioning grid, but through little fault of the utilities in some cases, right? I think we've had some pretty mismanaged situations in the U.S., and so I think it really just depends on competence, and that you know, can be in the private sector or the public sector, depending on the country you're in. And unfortunately, I think I think in some cases it's helpful to have the public control because it's a democratization of the energy supply. And if it's not working well, then you can see that reflected in electoral consequences. But I don't think that there's a uniform answer, unfortunately, to that, at least from my experience.
I'll just add one quick point on that, David. I think I'll share something from India again, the context on the electricity grid. What has happened is that even India has that emphasis on making sure everyone gets access to electricity. But the pieces that have been privatized first in the electricity utility market are the high density cities, because there the problem of access or some people not having access was not there. And it also made much more sense to the private sector there. So they came in there, but as a result, the transmission and distribution losses went from anywhere from 15 to 20% to like high single digits, right? So that's the kind of efficiency the private sector was able to achieve, where the public sector was not being able to achieve, whereas the public sector is still retaining control of areas that still have problems of distribution and access to poorer segments of the country. So it might be a mixed model is my point.
Yeah, I think this zero carbon future pavilion is all for more French-style nuclear, where there's inevitably lots of public control. And I guess I'll also add that with the energy transition, we also have private power at the level of the household. I mean, like solar panels on your roof where the household and the family controls them. And that's like a small-scale version of private, which wouldn't contribute to inequality in those ways.
Well, I unfortunately, I think we're out of time. If we can discuss after, perhaps. But I think we could go on for hours, and I'd actually like to. I've had a lot of fun, and thank you guys all for joining us here. I think we'll hang around for a bit, so if you're interested in continuing the conversation, we can do that. But thank you again all for coming, and have a good rest of your day.